Good evening, all. Good morning, all, from wherever you're joining. It is absolutely a pleasure to have you with us today. In fact, I think that we have a person today who possibly needs no introduction, possibly one of the most accomplished people that you would actually meet as a professional. He's done so much, but just a couple of things. In fact, the first time that I met Arun was a number of years back, and that was when he was actually the CEO for KPMG in India. He was heading one of the most gargantuan audit and consulting firms in India, and of course, one of the most influential as well. But before this role, in fact, he worked with President Obama as well. In fact, he was part of the administration as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets and Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Services. So he has done a lot of work with the government, with the private sector, and he understands the world of business through and through, from a policy perspective as well as from the real world, how things happen and how change can actually be brought in. And quite recently, he just authored a book called The Global Trade Paradigm. A very, very interesting text. In fact, I just loved reading it. In fact, we had a huge conversation on this book just about a couple of months back. Arun was kind enough to gift this to me, and I found it to be a very, very exceptional document in terms of understanding as to how global value chains function, how global value chains work, and so on and so forth. So broadly, like one of the great books that I've done. In fact, he has been associated with Stanford for many, many years in wearing many different hats. In fact, he was, and now we are looking at him really helping us with the India dialogue thing as well, or really pushing the agenda forward. So Arun, it's just an absolute delight and a pleasure to have you with us today for this conversation. And I'm sure everybody is going to love the interaction. But thanks a lot for joining in today. And if you give me a go ahead, we'll start the conversation.
No, thank you, Amit, and thank you, Richard, for having me. It's great to see the Stanford arches in all our screens. Great to be here.
Thank you, Arun. So, as I was going through a book, I found some very fascinating anecdotes, stories, points that you would actually share. But one thing that struck me was like how economies grow over a period of time. So my first point is like, could you share some insights on how economies and compulsions of trade have shaped national histories and fortunes of civilizations? Because that's a story that you do share, but a very powerful story. So over to you, Arun, on this.
Thank you, Amit. In fact, my book really is, in my view, the story of trade. It's not an analytical work. It's not, in some sense, it's not in any way based on empirical research. But it's really telling a story, a narrative. In fact, the very first line of the book says, the history of the world is in many ways the story of trade. And that's what I find so interesting, how trade has shaped history. To your question, historically, we've seen trade shaping economics, politics, cultures. And if you think about it historically, China was a major trading power. They had the Silk Route. The Silk Route was not really one route. It was a network of connections by which silk and other commodities were sold. And that held in place for something like 15 or 1600 years. They were then displaced by the Ottomans, kind of brought in barriers to trade, what we would today call barriers to trade, like tariffs. And they, in a way, blocked off the Chinese trade towards the West. So that began a period where trade then moved to the sea. And then you had the Europeans, led by the Portuguese, coming to the East by sea. That led to colonization. That led to Portuguese, and then subsequently Dutch and French and English colonization of the East. That's one whole story of trade shaping history. Then you had tea, a major export from China, again, shaping trade in very many ways. At one point, 10% of the revenues of the United Kingdom came from tax on tea. Tea became a monopoly of the East India Company in terms of supplying tea to the West. We know the famous story of the Boston Tea Party, which in many ways symbolized the start of the American independence movement. again, you have trade as a factor in shaping history. You go further down, you see the U.S. Navy actually being formed to combat the pirates of the so-called Barbary Coast, which is really North Africa, to again protect sea lanes. And today we talk about freedom of navigation. Well, the U.S. Navy was set up freedom of navigation to conduct trade with North Africa, and so on. And then as you go further down, you see opening up of Japan. You see the story of Britain's colonial empire. And then I'm kind of fast forwarding post the Second World War, the emergence of the US as a major trading power. So you had China, then eventually you had various Western countries, then you had the UK as the predominant trading power. Second World War, the US becomes the major trading power. Go further by a few decades, and then you have the emergence of China. And in between, you have Japan rising as an exporter. You have the East Asian countries rising as an exporter. And in all these cases with Japan, the East Asian countries, the so-called Asian tigers, and then the rise of China, trade drove their growth. Those exports of those countries drove the growth of incomes, and drove essentially the growth of prosperity in those countries. So that's a very quick sketch of covering something like 2,500 years or so. And as we look forward, it'll be really interesting to see how things shape in the future. We see, for example, India rising in its trade. It's still pretty small, but it's rising. As an economy, it's now become the third biggest economy, based on purchasing power parity, fifth nominally, certainly on a way to be the third largest economy. And it's the fastest growing economy in the world. And we see trade, and we will see that trade from India and to India will increase. So India will increasingly come back to becoming more consequential in trade. I mean, historically, remember, before colonization, China and India were the largest economies. China has come back to that position. India, in terms of purchasing power parity, and India is on its way to increase its economic position in the world. Africa is, as I mentioned in my book, is probably the sleeping giant. It's got the same population as India, but a geographic territory many times the size of India, rich in minerals and various natural resources. It has been hampered by actually the legacy of colonialism, which had the continent broken up into many countries, divided by straight lines that had been drawn far away. But those have now become countries. But these countries were not connected. Connectivity was very, very poor, has been very poor. In fact, until recently, it was cheaper to ship a car from BMW from South Africa to the United States than to ship it from South Africa to, say, a North African country. But the coming together of the African economic community, there's a big focus on increasing infrastructure and logistics on the continent, and that is going to make an enormous difference. We've seen that improved infrastructure and improved logistics can make a huge difference. I think in India, that's what we see. We see that improved infrastructure and logistics, and also removing various barriers to internal trade. In India, for example, the goods and services tax really streamlined internal trade, really made it for the first time into one common market. The more we see barriers to trade coming down, the more we see efficient infrastructure, transportation, and connectivity. All of that's going to drive increased trade and increased prosperity.
This is fascinating, Arun, like in terms of like the history of the world. If I may, and I have to hazard a guess because we were just in the middle of a pandemic and whatever. And during the last pandemic, like in the 1918, when the Spanish flu had actually happened, suddenly trade flourished thereafter. But how do you see that happening now? You are seeing signs of huge movement towards positive uptake on trade, or you're seeing some other sets of signs?
It's an very interesting question. First of all, from a overall GDP growth and also trade, there was certainly it was constricted during the pandemic and following the pandemic. So there's a bit of a bounce back from that. But there are other major lessons from the pandemic. One major lesson was a realization that as the world had become more integrated and in pursuit of comparative advantage, global value chains came about, essentially enhancing the global good. It also resulted in some vulnerabilities arising primarily from the concentration of manufacturing in one location, namely China. And when China was hit by COVID, the whole world had to face shortages, personal protective gear, active pharmaceutical ingredients, components for electronic products. All of these were constrained suddenly when you had a kind of choke point in China. And the pandemic brought that into view. And suddenly there was a realization that, rational supply chains should have redundancy, should have more sources than just one. And so we've seen since then a move towards diversifying supply chains. Now, in the meanwhile, I think China's fundamental comparative advantage has also changed. Their labor costs have gone up. China themselves would like to vacate some of the low value added areas and go into higher value added areas. Other countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam have been quite ready to pick up some of those. Now, a lot of the manufacturing is also beginning to make its move towards India. India's case, India's manufacturing capabilities, technological capabilities have really advanced a lot. And so I would expect to see more sophisticated manufacturing coming to India, which would be, in the global interest in terms of creating redundancies in supply chains in manufactured products. Manufacturing should essentially lift the Indian economy because the greater value added that it would provide. I also feel that Indian manufacturing prowess has really improved over the last several years in many areas. For example, automotive is an area where India has really improved, and there's been a dip in Indian growth in automotive exports, but it's coming back up. So the last year or two, we've seen pretty good pickup in automotive exports from India, which is one simple sign of manufacturing comparative advantage. But I also see here there's a lot of focus on advanced manufacturing technologies, entrepreneurs looking at the space, and we will see a lot of contributions in advanced manufacturing coming from India. Take, for example, the space program. Now we have a number of private companies pursuing rocketry and satellites and so forth, and all of them in more very sophisticated technology, which includes sophisticated manufacturing. So I think one of the results of the pandemic is going to be that there will be a diversification of sources of manufacturing, and India is going to be one of the contributors to enhancing redundancy for the world at large.
So, Arun, I would like to just step back to and enhance this question, or just take a step forward on this. What you're really saying is that there is a huge potential that international trade has in terms of uplifting the economies. But how do you really look at this aspect from the perspective of, say, job creation and improvement in incomes over a period of time? Because what we do see within a certain set of countries is that, of course, the countries have grown, there has been wealth accumulation at the top, the distributive aspect of economies or activities or economic activity has possibly not happened, because there is that criticism. And because this also creates that huge debate on the negative impact of globalization, because there is always that school of thought which says that globalization is not the right thing to do, or this is certainly going to give huge sets of issues across the world from income point of view, from cultural point of view, or whatever. But how do you see the world moving forward on this? So two questions gelled into one.
So the first thing is that globalization is a net benefit, which means all of us gain in a net sense. However, there are many groups for whom it's a net negative. So while all of us gain a little, there are some groups that lose a lot. So if you're in a business that is not competitive globally, then you stand to lose. Globalization means we all get products that are cheaper, and therefore, in some sense, our welfare is enhanced. But if I'm the one working on a product that I'm not competitive at, I lose my job. That job goes somewhere else. So you have this unevenness that everybody gains a certain amount, but some people lose a lot. And this includes potentially, fisher folk in the UK or farmers in many countries, and they are affected. And one of the challenges of moving towards freer trade is to make sure that these disadvantaged groups are protected in some way through trade assistance programs. Now, all countries that go into free trade agreements generally will create a trade assistance program. However, those programs are not necessarily very effective. Second, upskilling whole groups of people is not an overnight thing. So there is definitely a disruption that occurs, which is painful for those groups. And that's a political aspect that has to be handled. This is why free trade agreements are not generally easy to sell, and certainly very, very hard to sell in an election year or near an election year. It's very hard because it affects some people seriously who will make a big noise about it. And they will not be convinced that they will necessarily benefit. But in the long term, I think it's clear that free trade lifts incomes across the board in the long term. And there have been many studies on it. That's a logic that drives towards free trade. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, was put in place. It was based on very rigorous studies that showed that it would result in an increase in GDP for every country, increase in the welfare of every country. And that was a reason to go into it. Now, of course, unfortunately,
Arun, if I can jump in, your book backs that up. The history of the world shows this net benefit as being greater, that this is really how the world has moved forward for the last 4,000 years.
Correct. And the challenge politically would be to make sure you carry those small groups that don't, that feel temporary setbacks. And that's important. But yes, absolutely, on the long term. And that is why we see the increasing, the increase of these regional blocks. Since WTO has had various challenges, we see the rise of regional blocks. I mean, look at Asia. It's going to be the largest market with the CPTPP and the RCEP, both coming into play. And interestingly, neither the US nor India are part of either of these large trade agreements, despite the US having been a major driver of the erstwhile TPP, the short-lived TPP.
I think one of the points behind this is that the visibility of the benefits of trade for everybody in the economy are sometimes hard to see.
Correct.
You've got a democracy where everybody's vote counts the same. And if you're not participating in some global value chain in a competitive company, maybe you feel like somebody else is getting the benefit and not me. Do you have suggestions for how we can make the benefits of trade more visible?
Well, I think it's, to sell the benefits of trade, it's got to be through outreach and explanations. We did a lot of this when we were working for the TPP. I personally remember going to many communities, actually in many countries as well, talking about the benefits of that. But I think more tangibly, those who will get temporarily disadvantaged need to be helped, and they need to feel comforted that they will be helped. And it's got to be helped pretty substantially. Change is always difficult, and those who are the vortex of change find it particularly painful, and they really need to be supported. And I don't think enough of that has been done.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Amit, over to you.
Yes, Arun, as you really talk about how things have changed, how economic benefits can accrue, there are many countries who are participating in the global value chains. You did allude to what India is actually doing. But what we do see is that in the last few years, especially the COVID, there is this whole huge success of the vaccination. That is possibly because of the integration of the world economies, the world scientific knowledge, the prowess and things. And that's what kept the world going around. And you also said, like, as to how people were able to collaborate and things. And of course, there were those choke points. But what do you think are the challenges for the global value chains moving forward? Like, especially the Ukraine war that is seemingly having a huge detrimental effect, the way the oil blocks are actually behaving at points in time, and so on and so forth. So where do you see this really moving forward?
I certainly think that perturbations like Ukraine or other hostile situations threaten global value chains. To some extent, the world has to be prepared for such perturbations, and therefore astute business leaders should ensure that there is diversification in global supply chains. I think it's important for countries to be talking to each other. I mean, today, look at the China-US situation. We do see the US making a special effort to be talking to the Chinese. You know, you've got Secretary Blinken been there, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had been there, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is slated to go there. So there are certainly serious attempts to conversations and dialogue, because what we do not want to do is to end up with different hermetically sealed trading blocks. Today, there's a tremendous mutual interdependence between the US and China and many other countries, because China is, makes 25% of the manufacturers in the world. So there's a huge dependence with many countries. And it's really important that the world gets the benefit of more and more interdependence. And we don't push each other into situations where there are closed off zones. So, I think Asia is showing an example of people working together. If you look at RCEP and CPTPP, you're seeing that people are working together, but major economies like the US and India are not in those two trade agreements.
So this is fascinating, Arun, but we also see this whole huge, and I have to come back to this question on anti-globalization tirade that actually exists. There is also this very interesting rise of certain set of leaders, which you might call as populist or authoritarian or whatever, who are going ballistic against trade, protecting the economies and things. And US has also gone through that cycle. There are others who have gone through that similar cycle. How is politics going to really redefine the very economic agenda for the world? Because it is convincing enough. And we have seen it in the last 300 or 500 years. Like, we've had the most prosperous times of the world in the last few hundred years, especially driven through trade, sharing of knowledge, sharing of resources. But now there is this whole populist movement, which is affecting at least 20 to 30 countries in the world. How do you react to this?
I think it's a very worrisome movement, very, very worrisome. Certainly, there are some legitimate causes, as I mentioned, of people who felt they were left out of the system and they need to be helped. But to translate that into a fear of the other, into xenophobic attitudes, that is of great concern. And, we've seen that in many countries over time. I mean, if you remember, I remember the early days when Japan was exporting cars to the US, and US car industry was threatened, and there were Japanese cars being smashed in some places. I mean, what is that? That is just kind of a xenophobic attitude. Those are the worrisome things that come from extreme protectionism. I think it's really important that leaders see the big picture. That there should be enough countervailing voices to the voices that push for narrow protectionism. I think to some extent protectionism I can understand. I think it's important. I think it's important in terms of security reasons. In some cases could be important for employment reasons, but taken to an extreme, it's going to be counterproductive.
And so what you say is really interesting, because a lot of this is driven by the extremes of both right and extreme left,
Right.
whereas really trade is one of those things that needs to be you need to convince the middle.
Exactly.
You need to convince people to see that even though they're not directly involved in importing and exporting, or they're not directly involved in a global value chain, somehow they're benefiting from it.
Right.
I'm curious, though, you talk about world perturbations that we have to expect once in a while. It becomes even more dangerous when a country seems to have territorial ambitions. Do you see the situation moving forward between China and India, where there has been, border trouble for a number of years and it seems to be getting worse, or the situation in Taiwan? How should world trade respond to this kind of increased insecurity?
It's a very important question. I'm sure there aren't easy answers to it. But my feeling is that we have to just keep talking. I think confrontation, brinksmanship, all of that just adds to the costs of a successful global system. So keeping on talking, seemingly intractable problems historically have been solved through constant chipping away at it, and rarely through, one single formula. So I think it's a question of keeping on talking, and that's what the U.S. and China were doing for a very long time. I mean, there was a joint commission on commerce and trade with China that would meet a couple of times a year and go through lots of issues and really begin to try to understand each other and try to solve problems, maybe small problems, maybe medium-sized problems, but that was the whole attitude that was being cultivated by both countries. That seems to have shifted. It seems to me that it needs to move back towards more intense dialogue. And this applies to all countries, in fact.
So if I can follow up on that, and this is kind of a specific question, a lot of the recent worsening of U.S.-China relations really goes back to levying tariffs for, various punitive reasons, whatever the reasons were. I wonder what you would say about the use of tariffs as a kind of tool for international, diplomacy, for lack of a better word. When are they appropriate, and what is what kind of effect have they had on the situation right now?
So I think they're appropriate when there is, willful dumping, for example.
Uh-huh.
If a country tries to capture a market by selling below cost, a large and powerful economy can outwit a weaker economy, or a large sector of an economy can outwit other sectors by doing that. I think that would be a legitimate place where countervailing tariffs, etc., are valuable. Otherwise, I think it's best to discuss these and do these through negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Because every country can apply tariffs. So the US applies a tariff, China replies with another set of tariffs. We've seen this game in China and Europe.
So kind of moving sort of to the other side of this, how can we move back toward promoting multilateral alliances like CPTPP or RCEP? Can we get the political support for them?
I think this is where we need to have more trade fluency, trade literacy. People need to understand what global trade is all about. And that's one of the purposes of my writing this book, to, in simple terms, talk about what is trade, what are the implications, what are the pluses, minuses, where were we, how did we get here, where might we be going. And this is, just as we read about politics and defense, etc., I think it's really important to learn about trade. And I think the next frontier is going to be technology, the same way where trade has become something that's both beneficial, but also gets weaponized, as in the case of punitive tariffs. Technology is something that's could be extremely beneficial, but can also get weaponized. Of course, gets weaponized in certain ways, but it could be weaponized in multiple ways. So I think these are areas that need to be understood more broadly by people.
I think that's a really good parallel. It's the same kind of thing. You argue that your job is being taken away, whether it's by trade or whether it's by a new technology. And what happens is you take the benefits away from that picture. You put that, threat to jobs out of context. So one other kind of context that I'm personally when I grew up in a regional city in the state of Georgia.
Which town was that?
And I was in Valdosta, Georgia. Anyway, when I grew up, the idea of world trade was basically Japanese cars would appear once in a while. And most people don't feel connected to it. What are the ways in which they can see the kind of connections that you have if you're running a corner store, or if you're a school teacher in some regional city where there's not a whole lot of international interaction?
No, I think a part of it is just getting to know the world a lot more. One of the terms that I used when I used to be in the government was how, in terms of trade, was how we need to enhance what we call global fluency. People knowing more about the world, people not being threatened by the rest of the world. And I'm not sure what the big crop in Valdosta, Georgia was, but it could probably have found global markets. And folks in Valdosta could have got comfortable saying, hey, my onions or whatever they produce, or peanuts, are being brought around the world, and I'm happy to buy products made in other parts of the world. But that understanding of these global dynamics, I think it's really important. And I think this is a place where the educational system has to promote curiosity and understanding and confidence that we are not threatened by things that come from other parts of the world.
Do you think that's harder than before or easier than before?
Maybe in the last few years become a little harder, but by and large, we were on a very good path. And there are some parts talking about the US, there are some parts of the US that are more familiar with the rest of the world for various historical reasons, and others that are not. But I think a greater understanding of the world, a greater, less of, inward looking, local looking would really be helpful in my view. So
I would agree with you in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and in the US, the small and which are the major drivers of employment. In the US and around the world, India, same thing. What I found in my US government position was that when a small company started exports, they would grow not by 10% or 15%, they would grow by tenfold or fivefold. It would be dramatic growth when they found new markets. And then they would get comfortable doing that. They would go to one country, then they would go to more countries. So I think part of this is getting out there, embracing the world, and it's just going to result in good things, in my view.
So,
yeah,
Arun,
I agree.
This is interesting. Like, it's about embracing. And when you really talk about trade, and you have alluded to that, it is eventually land, labor, capital, and data that is actually going to get traded over a period of time. But what we do see within the US context, so I would like to get you to the US context for a moment. And if I may ask, like, there is a presidential election that is just going to happen within the next few months or whatever in the US. And if you have to, because there is at least one presidential candidate who is going ballistic against the idea of trade. He is saying that we have to make America great again, not that America is not great even now, and so on and so forth. So how would you really look at this? Like, how would you really tell, say, Mr. Trump, and how would you tell him that this is not the right way of looking at it? If you have to, because it's the dummy's guide to understanding trade. That's what I would say.
I mean, I think, for example, I would talk about the Seattle area, where suddenly Boeing is selling, 250 high-priced jets to a country far away like India. Why is that happening? Because of global trade. That's going to benefit, according to the administration, it's going to benefit millions of people in the US. It's a really good example. And by the way, that will benefit lots of people in India because of better transportation, the jobs that are created as Air India buys 250 planes from Boeing and so forth. So those are tangible benefits of trade. So the people in Renton, Washington, are going to stand up and say, yes, we see the benefit. Because without that, their jobs would be under some stress. I think the real issue is to show examples of tangible benefits that communities see from global trade. And that's just one example that I mentioned. It has to be not fought with rhetoric. It's got to be fought with actual stories of things that are happening.
So the real evidence in terms of like what's the kind of direct, indirect, induced impact that thing, and that is what the story has to be.
Right. You've got to have somebody from Renton standing up at the Democratic Convention and saying, I'm one of the beneficiaries of this.
Mm-hmm. But if I may ask, like if I may get deeper into the US question as well, and I'll try to bring in that whole regional aspect into the US. What we see within the US is that there are certain states which have done exceptionally well over the last few decades. Like if you really talk about the Bay Area or California, New York, Massachusetts, but there seem to be certain set of states who are lagging behind. And that's the same story for a place like India as well, or even China for that matter. In India, you can say that there are about 6 different states which grow exponentially, which grow fast, but other states are lagging behind. That creates income disparities and whatever. In light of this, because if the stories are happening in California or Massachusetts, how do you explain it to a state which has possibly not grown? How do we showcase it as an example to saying that, okay, no, you have to really, work on it, or what are the areas that you have to work on?
No, there are good examples of states that attracted industry. Take South Carolina, take parts of Georgia, the way they attracted automotive industry, the way there are aircraft manufacturers who set up shop in South Carolina, for example, and some of the southern states. Those are quite recent developments. They were not traditionally major manufacturing states. So I think there are real examples for people to see. And I think the federal government has an interesting role to create and develop platforms for states to compete with each other, to increase exports or to increase FDI. I was associated with one of them in the Department of Commerce called Select USA. It was a federal program where we would bring folks from around the world who wanted to invest and create jobs through setting up factories or various other operations in the US. And states would come to this Select USA meeting and compete for these investments, which would create jobs, and generally high-paying jobs in their states. So I think a sense of competitiveness, which I see a lot now. Certainly we see that in the US, we see that in India, for example. I think those are some of the factors that can help to disperse trade and investment into the areas that did not previously receive them as much as the successful West Coast, East Coast. So,
So Amit asked about the United States. I'd like to ask about India in regard to how India can benefit from trade moving forward. The whole regional issue, are there things that India can do to kind of ensure that the benefits of trade are inclusive as it moves forward? How do you see India's position also relative to the other G20 countries? Is it in a unique position, or, if you could comment, that would be great.
Yeah. So if you keep out the advanced G20 countries and look at the other countries, then I think India is distinguished by its talent and its technology prowess. I mean, the talent you see in India, their motivation is really very, very impressive. Their ambition. So I feel that's very distinctive. And India is a large country. It's got kind of a bench strength of capabilities that smaller countries in the G20, again, apart from the advanced countries, will not have. So therefore, India is positioned in many ways in terms of overall capacity and capability closer to the advanced countries, because a large country, there is a large enough group that has those capabilities. I think India will benefit vastly from trade. I mean, look at China. I mean, their growth, China's economy is many times India's economy. And what made that happen? At one time, both countries were at the same level. So really a relentless push on exports and on trade and on FDI to support all of that. It's a good example for India to follow, and can be followed with its own variations as suits India. So I think there are good examples. There are smaller countries. I mean, look at Korea. It's actually a small country, but it had a very big GDP. At one time, their GDP was, competing with India's GDP for a much smaller country. So there are many good examples of growth right in the neighborhood that India can look at and emulate. And I think leadership in India understands that.
So in regard to the regional differences or other things like the Gini index, because one of the characteristics of China growth was really a stretching of the gap between rich and poor. The eastern cities are doing a lot more than the interior is. Other than just direct social programs, how can India kind of have a better model even?
Now that same situation exists in India. If you look at the states in India, the growth rates are uneven. There are states growing at 20 to 30% faster rates than the average, and others growing slower. So that's definitely true in India. Again, geographically, you can see that the southern states and some of the coastal states on the west coast are ahead of the rest of the country. But I think some of the equalizers are going to be better infrastructure, better mobility, including people mobility. So the more prosperous states, we see migrants from the less prosperous states. Well, that's going to increase incomes in the less prosperous states and funnel back savings into those states, which will in fact help those states. So I think the greater integration of India logistically and through infrastructure is one area. The second is going to be education and skills. It's a huge area, but really, this was part of China's success. Their focus on education from the primary school onwards was very, very. It was a big causal factor in their being ready for growth and they're growing. We see the same thing. We would see the same thing here. So, increased focus on basic human welfare, education, healthcare is going to be very, very important, as important as infrastructure and logistics.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about kind of national level strategies. Tanisha in our audience asks, how can MNCs like KPMG capitalize on India's capabilities to advance trade and business so as to reap more inclusive benefits? The role of the private sector in this.
But first of all, multinational corporations have found India to be a great source of talent. So, and COVID, when people could work virtually across the world, gave that a greater fill-up. So we have companies, many large companies, which have either the largest employee populations or second largest employee populations sitting right here in India, serving global markets, serving global needs. So that's already happening. In some sense, that provides for some equalization of opportunity and rewards and incomes between the West and India. However, what can be done within India in terms of inclusion? At one level, having corporate policies of diversity, including women, empowering minorities. Those would be, those are the right kinds of values that the multinational corporations can promote in India, and many are, and that will spread into the Indian system. Those are some of the areas where I feel multinational corporations can really contribute.
And Arun, I would just like to go back to your previous answer, and that is where you were giving a very positive view in terms of like how India is growing, or we are the third largest economy as per PPP, fifth largest as per nominal GDP. But the biggest criticism that happens here is, and if I really take it on per capita income, US is close to about $80,000. India is at about $2,600. Luxembourg is about 130 odd thousand dollars. Uh, as an aggregate number, it looks very fascinating that India is the fifth largest. But on what do you call GDP per capita, we are possibly in the late 90s. So how do you really look at this issue? Because we will have to grapple this at certain point in time. Because is this metric the right metric in terms of saying that we are the fifth largest, or the metric has to be per capita GDP?
No, Amit, I couldn't agree with you more. The GDP is just a number, and you cannot measure the country's welfare by just a GDP number. I mean, when we talk about China and India having been the biggest economies, like Angus Madison's famous study, what was that? So number of people multiplied by a certain common productivity per person. At that point, before the technology, before the industrial revolution, all human beings had pretty much the same productivity. So the larger number of people led to larger GDP. Today it's very different. Today you have India and China at the same level of population, but you can see the difference in GDP because of productivity, production, and so forth. So I think the GDP number by itself is not something that by itself connotes success. Per capita is much more important. Median might be even more important. So the right statistic to look at might well be median income. What's a Gini coefficient? All of those are very important. I think very, very important. So I would agree with the premise that don't get carried away by being the third largest or fifth largest GDP. It doesn't mean anything if your per capita income is at the levels it's at today. On the other hand, we're seeing an increase in per capita income. We're seeing an increase in median income. We're seeing people moving out of poverty into the middle class. And within India, you can see that there are some states that have relatively no poverty, other states with minimum poverty, and yet other states with too much poverty. So it's a very uneven picture. So when all states can get to a point where there's no poverty, then we should feel better about the GDP numbers. Until then, I don't think we can rest on the GDP numbers.
Mm-hmm. So, this is quite interesting, and I fully agree with what you're saying, because we have to really dig deeper in terms of understanding as to how things are happening. But let's take a step forward. Right now, India is in the middle of this whole G20 season. In fact, you were participating in one of the G20 events just about last week. And now we are actually having the Leaders Summit just about 8 days from now. Mm-hmm. How do you think that G20 has an important role for India? Or is it just one of the things, or is it an event? Or is it something like a huge impact that India can actually create?
What I saw was that India has kind of orchestrated a number of countries to come together to discuss various issues of importance, really not to humanity as a whole. So I think that's very laudable, what's been done. I was more close to what was happening in the B20, the business group, and I was very impressed by the fact that literally thousands of people from 20, actually more than 20 countries had come together to develop agreement on what was going to be important going forward and what should be done about that. And whether it was digital public infrastructure or women's empowerment, there were a number of topics that really cut across all the countries and were of common concern. So I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to have that kind of conversation that's constructive, forward-looking, and also looks at the gaps that need to be filled. Doesn't shy away from admitting there are gaps that need to be filled. So I thought it was a good thing. I wasn't familiar with previous G20 sessions or how they went, but what I saw here, I thought very high quality content was produced by the B20 group.
Mm-hmm. And just something that I'm sure you've worked on over a period of time, and more from a business perspective, not as a economic development view. I think there is also this view of business models which are going to be emerging across the world. And I have to ask you that question because you've worked in the field. What kind of business models would actually you think emerge from India over a period of time? And because I'm asking this question for a simple reason, and that is my understanding. I could be horribly wrong, and you can tell me if I am, that in the next phase of growth, it's going to be countries like India which will give the models for the world or business models for the world, because the Western models might not be applicable in low resource settings. You'll have to create something new, and maybe India has the capacity. And that is where that whole G20 idea as well of the global South is also emerging. Would you agree with that, disagree with that? And or you could actually tell me that I'm absolutely naive and stupid as well.
No, I don't know personally whether there's a Western model or an Indian model, but when I look at the future for India, I think if it can leverage its talent, focus on talent and technology, that could be knowledge. Those could be important aspects of competitive advantage. In fact, in my closing chapter in my book, I talk about knowledge flows. So far we've been talking about trade and services, but knowledge and technological capabilities. These could be areas that could be a model that India could really use to advance itself. So I would not necessarily call it an Indian model because other countries have trod the technology and knowledge model. I mean, the United States is a great example, and others as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's going to be important.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I would like to read a paragraph from your book. And that's the last paragraph, which I found to be very, very important. And I hope everybody gets motivated to read the book after this. And that is, the world is thus in the midst of confluence of new emergent forces, rapidly diverging worldviews and muscular national politics, concerns related to the natural world and health security, as well as the ubiquitous surge of new technology, universal data, and instantaneous communications. How these newly dominant forces will act on each other and how the future flows of global trade will be driven are matters about which we can currently only make informed guesses. Given the speed of change and the turbulence that we are currently witnessing, history has a way of looking back on itself as also of springing surprises. The difference between a simple pendulum and a chaotic one. The story of human progress has demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and resilience, the power of technology in enhancing our ability or our facility to rapidly innovate and adapt may indeed be the beacon that illuminates the future of trade. Very powerful statement here. In fact, I think this was the most interesting paragraph that I read because it sums up what we are really going through and what are the challenges that we actually see. Any remarks on this last paragraph that you've written? Because I think this is your love of labor, which I see in this paragraph out here in the book.
No, thank you, Amita. It was very kind of you. Yeah, I believe that. I feel looking forward. I think the world is going to be driven by knowledge flows, as I mentioned. We've seen the story of trade tells us that there's expansion, there's contract, there's outward looking, inward looking, outward looking. We've seen this before. It's a story that we've seen before, but overall, the movement has been towards more expansion, really leading towards more abundance. In fact, what I'd like to do is really loop back to my dedication, where in the book I dedicate this to my grandchildren in the future. It says, for Zaran, Saira, Ishan, and Laila, with my hope and prayer that theirs would be a word of kindness, peace, and abundance. And how are we going to get this abundance that will lead to kindness and peace? Is really through the words that you read out from my last paragraph.
Absolutely. And I think I can't disagree with you on this at all, because we need a world which is peaceful, wherein we are able to respect each other, we are able to understand differences, we are able to appreciate whatever one wants to believe in, and from an atheist to whatever, and that's a broad spectrum, and we need to respect.
If I can kind of make a final comment about this matter, one thing I got from our discussion this morning is that as powerful as trade is in having these benefits for people, it does depend on education, on continually talking to each other and learning about each other. And especially with international trade, there's a lot of cross-cultural education that has to happen for this to be really mutually successful. So I want to thank you for your comments this morning about an incredibly important topic. This is probably the number one or number two topic that people have to concern themselves with over the next 100 years. Thank you, Arun.
Arun, thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us today. This has just been a fascinating interaction. We could have gone on again for hours on this. I remember the conversation that we had a few weeks or a few months back, and I just love that continuation of that whole dialogue. But I must also thank you for supporting the India Dialogue. In fact, if you don't mind, I would like to tell that you have agreed to be on the advisory board for the India Dialogue, and we look forward to your contributions in really making this whole research effort on India a very successful one as we move forward. I would like to thank the audience as well for joining in, and look forward to the next session on the 28th of September. But Arun, absolutely a pleasure. Thanks a lot for joining in.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Richard. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for inviting me to be on the advisory board, and I really look forward to working with you both. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, please. And be well and be safe, Arun. Look forward to catching up soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.